The end is in sight. Hopefully, most of you are listening to this episode while you are officially on a break from school. I sincerely hope I'm picturing each of you. Maybe you're on a brisk midday walk just because you can and you've got your earbuds in. Or maybe you're sitting and you're wrapping presents for the upcoming holidays and you're listening to this episode. That's how I'm envisioning you right now. But wherever this episode finds you, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Whether this is your first episode or your 214th, and you've been with me all of the last 4 years. Because of you, because you are listening, I'm going to continue doing this for a 5th year, and I'm just excited for what is to come. I never would have thought 10 years ago when I started It's Not Rocket Science that a decade later, I would be saying, I'm a podcaster, and I have been for the last 4 years. That's insane to me. And if you want a say, as I've been saying, if you want to say in what you hear in your earbuds next year in 2026, I would love for you to fill out this survey. I do this survey annually, and y'all, I read, my eyeballs see every single submission. I'm sure I could submit it to ChatGPT and get a summary, but I do this old school and I read line by line every single word that is submitted. And I genuinely take every response. And that is how I plug in and plan all 50 episodes that will go into 2026. So love to hear from you. bit.ly/SSSpod2026. And that link is in the show notes as well. Now that I'm done being sappy and thanking you while also getting excited for the new year because I have such new year, new me energy. It's not even funny. Anyway, all that to say, this week, we're still celebrating 2025. And I have the number 2 most listened to episode of the year to share with you. And it is all about teaching scientific inquiry and inquiry-based teaching strategies. But because this is the Secondary Science Simplified podcast, you know, if you've listened to any of these episodes before, that I care so much about equipping you practically and not just theoretically. And you may have had training about inquiry-based teaching in the past, and it may have been highly theoretical. And I'm here to kind of debunk that, and let's actually talk specifics here. I had one incredible professor in my undergrad and graduate programs that helped me so much practically. I think he was my only professor that was actually practical. And he inspired me so much to do that for y'all. So I really hope this episode is practical. So we're going to cover what inquiry is, why students hate it or are really just opposed to it naturally, why it's critical we do it anyway, even though they push back on it so hard, how to increase inquiry-based learning and teaching strategies in your toolbox and what you're already doing. I'll share my specific thoughts on the 5E model because a lot of people always ask me why don't you write your unit plans in the 5E model? I'll address that specifically. And then 3 just simple ways to get started, especially if you're overwhelmed and you're being challenged to do more inquiry, but you don't know where to start. I'm going to give you 3 simple ways. Ready? Let's get to it. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. First and foremost, what is inquiry? At its core, it is student-centered instruction. It's this shift from it always being teacher-centric, where you have a teacher at the front of the room and all the students are looking at that teacher and they're delivering information, to students being at the center of the instruction, at the center of their own learning. So it's student-centered, but it's also question-driven. You, the teacher, are going to ask them questions and get them thinking, get those wheels turning, but they also, in turn, are to be asking you questions and asking each other questions. Inquiry also really requires active engagement. Students need to be exploring, investigating, collaborating with each other, problem solving, drawing connections to what they're doing in lab with what they're doing in class, to what they've already learned, to what we're going to be learning in the future. All of those things. So lots of verbs you just heard me say, that's inquiry. And then lastly, the other word I would use to describe inquiry is constructivist. It's learners building their own understanding rather than just receiving understanding. Okay, so if that's like the quick bullet points of what it is, why does it make sense that students hate it? Well, because think about everything I just said, all those verbs. That's a lot of action. It's a lot of doing. And that's a lot harder than just sitting and listening for most students. It's a lot harder than that traditional sit and get kind of teaching that a lot of us, you listening, especially, if you're a millennial or older, that's the kind of instruction you received. If you're listening and you're about to start your first year teaching as a 22-year-old fresh out of college, hopefully you experience a lot more inquiry-based instruction in the classrooms that you grew up in. But for, people around my age and older, sit and get was like how we learned. Like I always think back, I've shared this before. I never had a good history teacher growing up. So because of that, I've never liked history. And as an adult, I've gotten really into historical fiction novels. And my husband has always loved history. So he's always wanting to watch these movies and documentaries and things. And I'm learning so much as an adult. And I'm like, why did I not? This is so interesting. Like, why did I hate history growing up? And it's because every history teacher I had either sat in a chair or on a stool at the front of the classroom, or maybe if they had more energy, stood at a podium and they lectured from a textbook. And then they had us color maps. Like that is the summary of my historical education K through 12. And I took AP history, so I never even took history in college. Okay, so that to me is like the epitome of sit and get. And so in a sense, it's just so easy just to sit and do that. But it doesn't create any like long-term lasting understanding. It does not really grow students at all. And it definitely doesn't engage them unless they naturally just love a topic. Like obviously I had peers in my classes that still loved history, and so they got into it. But for the rest of us, we just kind of sat there and passively absorbed. I'm sure you've seen those memes and reels as science teachers where students have their heads laying on textbooks and they're saying they're trying to learn by osmosis, which I literally hate those. I'm like, you're trying to learn by diffusion, moving from higher concentrations to lower concentrations, and you're not learning from water, which is osmosis. Diffusion specific to water is osmosis. Drives me insane, but that's what students are wanting to do. They just want to learn passively. They just want it to be absorbed into them. And so, of course, this is not something they want to do. Like I said, I used words like active, engage, explore, investigate, problem solve, collaborate. Like that's what defines inquiry. So that is a lot more than just sitting and getting. And then the last thing I'll say for why students probably give you a lot of pushback on this, if that's what you've experienced, is it really depends on the teachers they've had before you. You might be, I sincerely hope not, but you might be the first person forcing them to learn in a different and more challenging way. And let me tell you, I've been there and it is hard, especially if you are teaching in like those transitional years. Like I found when I was at a private school, and I'd always taught ninth grade bio my entire career. But when I switched to a private school, I got a bunch of other courses, including teaching high school physical science to the 8th graders. So those 8th graders especially, like they had only been in elementary school and middle school classes, and they had only received sit and get teaching. They were used to getting study guides before every test that were the test questions with words deleted, that then in class, they did them together and they kind of filled in the blanks, and then they just memorized those and then passed the test the next day. Like it was a rude awakening when they walked into Rebecca Joyner's 8th grade physical science class. Or in past years, when I just taught at a traditional high school, not a K through 12 school, when I taught ninth grade bio, I might have been the first person who was ever pushing them in this way. And so there's just going to be resistance. Anytime you're doing something new, you don't have the muscles to do it. So it's going to be really hard. Okay. So for speaking of muscles, give you a little exercise analogy. I think I've talked on here before. About 2 years ago, I started doing CrossFit. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I love doing it though, because one, there's so many analogies just to teaching and real life in it. But two, I had worked out from home for years with little dumbbells and my little exercise videos, but I walk into class and they're having me climb a rope. It's like, okay, I haven't done that since I was maybe in high school gym, and that was traumatizing. And most likely, if I even remember correctly, I probably got a note so that I could sit out that day that we did rope climb, so I didn't have to do it. So it's not like day one that I walked into a CrossFit gym and they told me to do a rope climb, I could do it. I could not do a rope climb. So instead, there were all these modifications that I had to tackle first to grow the muscles to then equip me 2 years later to be able to even do a partial rope climb, which is where I'm at now. So think of that like with your students. If you're being the first person to expose them to inquiry-based learning and inquiry-based instructional methods, you're asking them to do things that they have no muscles for. And so of course, they're going to be like, I just can't do it. And so it's going to require some scaffolding, which we're going to get into. But also like, if you just constantly say like, okay, you never have to do a rope climb, you never have to do inquiry-based education, they will never build those muscles. Okay. So it's our job to help them in that. And that's what we're going to do. And so that kind of leads me into this next part, which is like, why it's critical we do this, okay? They will never, ever grow out of this mindset, this apathy, this inability to learn this way unless we force them to. And that's why the beginning of the year is the perfect time to start instilling new habits and new rules and new systems, because inquiry learning requires so much more critical thinking than any other type of traditional instruction they may have received. And that is what students need now more than they ever have before. Y'all, I just think of Bloom's taxonomy. If you're like me, you hear the word Bloom's taxonomy, you're just picturing the triangle. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it right now while you're listening, Bloom's taxonomy. You're going to see this triangle and you'll see like, I hate to say back in the day, but it's true. Like back in the day, remembering and explaining was like an important part of being a master at your craft. Like if you were going to be a science person going on to med school or going on to some sort of like graduate school in a science field, you were required to know a lot of stuff, do a lot of remembering, a lot of explaining. I mean, I even think back just to the AP biology exam. That's how it was. It was a ton of memorization, a ton of content. And now with all of this access to information at all times, students don't really need to remember and recall and do that really much at all, even explaining, because they can just look up an explanation within seconds. And not even now, they don't even have to go to multiple sites. They'll just see an AI summary at the top of their webpage and use that. Now, really, when we're thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, that apply level is almost like the starting place for students. And then from there, we're pushing them to analyze, evaluate, create. So it's so important that we do this, or else we're never going to push them into those levels of learning that they really need to be able to get to nowadays, that just learning in general is just so different from how it has been. And I also think it's important that we do this and we incorporate inquiry whether or not they like it, because this is a starting point for just combating apathy like across the board in your classroom. I have a lot of opinions about combating apathy, and I'm going to link every episode I've kind of done about this in the show notes already. So if you haven't, episode 64 was how to re-engage apathetic students and manage your own apathy. 123 is about what to do when you care more than your students. 145 is how to build resilience in post-pandemic students, because I found that's something that kind of goes hand in hand with apathetic students. And 155 is how to create active and accountable learners. So I'm not going to rehash all of those, but those are all episodes you need to check out if you're really listening to this and just thinking like there's so much pushback from students. Listen to those episodes and hopefully they will equip you. Now, let's move on from why students are going to hate it, because whether or not they hate it, we're going to do it anyways, right? And so let's talk about how to increase inquiry-based learning in our classrooms this year. So first and foremost, y'all, it must become the norm. You can't just put a POGIL. If you don't know what a POGIL is, you should Google it, because I do love them. But you can't just put like one POGIL in per unit and check the box of like, I've taught inquiry, and think that that is going to change the culture of your classroom. Inquiry has to be integrated into the very DNA of your classroom. It needs to be this expectation of how your classroom is run, or else everything's going to be going fine. And then it's POGIL day and they're all like complaining because I don't want to do this. Every single day, there needs to be some sort of thinking in the way of inquiry so that it just becomes the norm. And that's where my second tip comes in. It helps so much to start from day one with this. If you can even do an inquiry activity on the first day of school, I think that is ideal. Even if it's not like a full-on inquiry, something that's very student-centered must be done on the first day of school. And if you want to hear more of my first day of school tips and what I cover in my first units, check out episode 141 of the podcast. I'll link that in the show notes. Another critical thing for inquiry-based learning is asking questions and getting students to also ask you questions. That is another part of your classroom culture that needs to just be foundational. Again, I have a whole episode on this. I did my very first year of this podcast. It's episode 47. So it's an oldie but goodie. but it's so important. And I'll talk to you about how to make discussions like critical in your classroom. I always had teachers observing me and admin observing me in my classroom. And one of the things that always got commented on, which was how they were surprised how much of my classroom was just this back and forth discussion the entire class period without it like getting out of hand from a management perspective. And I genuinely think it's because I set that tone from day one. Like all of us are speaking every single day. And I know we have shy students. I know we have students on various spectrums of comfortability and just ability in general when it comes to social engagement and talking and things like that. But that's where I'm like so obsessed with using popsicle sticks and starting from day one, drawing names and letting students know, like, I will be talking to you twice out loud every single day, but I'm going to partner with you to make sure that's a way that you feel comfortable and safe doing that. So quick side note, even though I've talked about this before, I feel like I have to say it. Beginning of the year, I put every student's name on a popsicle stick. I keep it in a plastic bag or like a cup, typically a beaker at the front of my classroom. And within every class period, I go through the beaker twice. So that helps me make sure that I'm calling on every student at least twice. I also use these to make all groups and things like that. But you will start to learn which of your students can handle being talked to in front of others. And so you can kind of set them up. If you draw a name of a student who's not going to feel comfortable answering a question, you can draw their name and have them ask a question instead. Like, hey, if you don't want to answer my question, ask a question instead to increase your understanding. Or sometimes I would give them like one skip in class, but then they know their name's going back in the cup and it's going to come up later. So I have a lot of tips on that too. I believe I have a podcast episode about popsicle sticks, so I'll link that in the show notes as well. But getting them to ask questions is critical. And that's one of my like top tips right there too. I'll add that in. I think I was going to say 4, but let's make this number 4 and then I'll still have number 5. So number 4 is like, if you ask a student a question and they don't have an answer to the question, then they can't just say, I don't know. They need to respond back with a question. You train them like, okay, it's not just that. And that leads me to number 5. We're going to hold the line. Like, just because they say, I don't know, or I don't get it, like we don't just give up and then tell them the answer. One thing I do with my kids all the time, okay? And at this point of recording this, my kids are 3, 6, and 7. But I say when they come to me and they complain about something or say they don't understand or they don't get it or whatever, is I say that sounds like a problem, but you are a problem solver. And this reminds my kids not just to complain, but to actually ask a question. Because a lot of times, like right now, my 6-year-old is really wanting to tie her own shoes. And so she'll just be like, I can't tie my shoes. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds like a problem, but you're a problem solver. And that reminds her like, oh, one way I can solve this problem is by asking for help. And then she will rephrase and say, hey, mommy, would you please help me tie my shoes? And then I'm like, oh, I would love to help you. I would love to be a part of the solution. But I just think reminding them that we're not just going to like make these complaining statements and also speaking truth over them, speaking truth over your students, like you are a problem solver. Let's use your brain. And even if you don't know the answer, what's a question you could ask to help you get to the answer? Or what's a tool you can utilize to help find the answer? I think that's really, really equipping for students. Okay, so those are 5 ways or just kind of like overall methodologies I think you can use to increase inquiry-based learning. I want to address quickly my specific thoughts on 5E, and then I'll give you like 3 really simple get started tips that are super practical at the end. So hang with me, okay? Okay, first let's talk about 5E. I don't feel like I could talk about inquiry without mentioning it. So if you don't know what the 5E model of instruction is, it stands for engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And I love it. First, because I love alliteration. So I just think it's great. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's wonderful and I incorporate a ton of this. But people often ask me why I don't write my unit plans or my lesson plans in the 5E model. Because if you're going to be a purist to the 5E model of instruction, every single lesson plan you do will be written out. Like, here's how we're going to start the class with engagement. Here's how they'll explore it. Here's how I'll explain it. Here's how we'll elaborate or kind of like reinforce and build on it. And then here's how it'll be evaluated or assessed. And so the reason I don't write my plans like this is simply that I just don't like doing the same things over and over. And now I know this may sound contradictory because if you've listened to this podcast or been in my corner of the internet for a while, you know that I like love routine and rhythms and organization. But I just think if we're always following the same instructional sequence, even if it's as beautifully designed as engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate, it still just gets rote and robotic. to me, it gets just as rote and robotic as the old school instructional sequence of like explain, explore, reinforce. And I think that creates apathy and boredom. It does it in a better way, like definitely a more engaged way, but I still think it gets boring. And so I think one of the ways that we keep students actively engaged is changing things up. Now, we always have a plan. You know that I'm a big proponent of having your agenda on a whiteboard every single day and having it not just on a slide you project, but having it written somewhere in your classroom so they can see it and know that there's a plan for the day. I think clarity is kindness. That's another thing I've said here a lot. And so for students to see what the plan is, to be clear about it is a kindness to them. It helps eliminate chaos. They know what to expect. I think that's good for them. But each day looking different, I also think is going to engagement. If they walked in every single day and the lesson plan was just like engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate, like that would get boring. So how I do my lesson plans, which you'll see if you own any It's Not Rocket Science units, is I plan out the unit holistically. And I think every teacher author, every curriculum designer has their own unique gifts. And there are things that other teacher authors do that I don't do. I don't do well at all because I don't have the gifts for them. But I do think one thing that's super unique to me is my ability to design units holistically. I think one thing I do well is I can see the end goal. I can see the big picture purpose of a unit, and my brain knows how to take that and break it down into every single step we need to take to get to that end goal and to do it in a way that there's a lot of variety and stuff. So when I'm designing any of my units, I'm like, here's the essential question. Here's the big idea. Here's what I want them to be able to do and know and just engage with by the end of this unit. Okay, here is how I'm going to build up to that with a variety of instructional methods and resources throughout the unit so that every single learner, those more creative ones, those more practical, concrete ones, everyone's going to get engaged and we're all going to get to this end goal together through a variety of ways. So like, yes, every unit that I write has, lecture notes for each concept, and every unit has 3 to 6 concepts we cover for consistency's sake. I just think as much as we've moved away from teacher-centered instruction, like the lecture notes will never die. So there are those for every unit. But then on top of that, I'm looking at the whole unit and I'm making sure, okay, are there a couple inquiry activities? Is there at least like one pretty hefty lab? Usually there's one hefty lab and like a couple of more like lab activities that are a little bit more minor. Is there a project that's more creative? Do I have practice for reinforcement? But like the specific methodology or order is going to be varied based on the topic. Some topics we can engage and explore and then go into the explaining, just like the 5E model would suggest. Others, and a lot of them, I think the topics are so big that we do a lot more like engage, explore, explain, circle back to explore. Now explain a little bit more. Now explore more, a little bit more. Now explain more, and then elaborate. And then maybe we're going to explore again. Like we're kind of hopping around and going through those 5Es, not necessarily in chronological order. So long answer to that question. That's why I don't write my lesson plans in that model. It'd be too complicated because we'd be going back and forth between all these different E's. And so all of those elements are there though. Like I promise, I've told people before, like if you want to use It's Not Rocket Science units, but you're required to write your unit plans in the 5E methodology, first let me tell you that all my unit plans come in editable Word docs so that you can change the format. Because I know a lot of schools have like specific unit plan formats they need. But the other thing I recommend is just getting a highlighter and assigning a color to like each of the 5Es. Engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate, and then just printing out your unit plan and highlighting like which of the components on the It's Not Rocket Science unit plan are each of these things, and just showing that they're all going to be hit many, many times throughout the unit. So that's my answer to that. So let's wrap up this episode with 3 simple ways to get started, okay? These are going to be mega practical, so I hope you have stayed with me to hear. Okay, first, if you feel overwhelmed by inquiry and you want to increase it, the easiest way to do this is engage before you explain. Okay, that's the bare minimum. I'm not even talking about exploration. Okay, but engage students in the topic, have some sort of real world connection or phenomenon that is going to be interesting to them, and give them that so that they're interested before you at least start explaining. If you are an It's Not Rocket Science resource user, go to the NGSS alignment guide. It's in the implementation folder of each of my units, and you'll see a list of phenomena you can do. That's a starting place. I'll leave it there. Okay. So that's the first like baby step to get started. Engage before you explain. We need to be doing something like that before we're just diving into lecture notes. Now, kind of second step from here, or second application here, simple start methodology, would be explore when you can before explaining. Okay, now I know there's some topics that like you just can't do that. It would take a lot of time for me to get students to explore calculating allele frequencies and understanding that prior to just teaching them directly how to do allele frequencies. But there are other topics that of course they can explore it before we explain it. Like, of course they can look at patterns and come up with periodic trends, looking at the periodic table before we just lecture on periodic trends on the periodic table. Okay, so when you can, get them exploring before you explain. Now, I know sometimes you're like, well, I can't come up with these inquiry activities where they explore. And I get it. Like, I've said this so many times. You can be an excellent teacher and not a curriculum writer. Like, those are two separate skill sets and two separate jobs. So don't feel bad if you're like, I'm not good with coming up with these ideas. Like, get the ideas from someone else, purchase the resources from someone else. But if you want to just use what you already have, ask yourself, okay, could they just do the lab first? Or whatever the reinforcing activity was, could I give them just a little bit of background knowledge so they could actually do this and explore and mess with it before we do the lecture notes? Is that possible? Or another simple solution is if you have the POGIL books, which I'll link where you can find those in the show notes because I know I've referenced it a couple times now. You're like, what is that? Go and see if there's just a POGIL for it first. That's a simple thing, but I don't want you to just think doing a POGIL counts as all your inquiry. But that's one thing you can do is try to do a POGIL. It is a great starting point from there. So engaging before you explain at a minimum, exploring before you explain, even better. If you can engage, explore, explain. Okay. And then the last starting point I'll say is this: everything can be a question and or a discussion. Start that now. Start that today. Start asking more questions and start forcing your students to ask more questions. If they don't have an answer to your question, make them ask you a question back for clarity's sake. That is such a good life skill to be able to ask good questions. I mean, I just even think of it from a social perspective. Oftentimes I find when I leave a social situation that I often carry the conversation by question asking, but I think it's because I have so much practice now asking questions and other people don't, so they don't think to ask questions. It's a muscle I've built. So let's build those muscles in our students. Ask them questions and get them to ask you questions. And I think one way we can do that is from, again, the very first day, do something inquiry, do something at a minimum that's just very student-centered. If you own any of my It's Not Rocket Science units, okay, I'll give you a couple examples. The physical science unit, the first one is Science Foundations. I rewrote it this summer. I'm obsessed with it. It could honestly be the first unit in any science course. But on the first day of school, I have them do stations called Science Foundation Stations. And it's all like getting them thinking, getting them asking questions. I'm obsessed with these stations. So that's something you can do day one. My first unit in my biology curriculum is called Biology Basics. On the first day, we're diving into some lab stations on safety and equipment and measurement review. And that's just to kind of, at least, it's not necessarily inquiry because they should already know a lot of this stuff from other sciences, but it's at least student-centered. It's at least active engagement. It's at least saying what do they know and putting the learning back on students and starting from day one saying I'm not just going to have you write notes about lab equipment per se. You need to be able to learn about it on your own. Related to that in chemistry, my first chemistry unit is called Introduction to Chemistry. And we do some discovery stations, which are some of the more inquiry stations that I've written. I have some in all my different curricula where students have to read and answer questions and potentially do tasks. So there's some in chemistry that they do on the first day. And then in anatomy, my first anatomy unit is Introduction to Anatomy. And on the first day of school, I have them do an inquiry activity from my biology curriculum. So I do this in my ecology unit in biology, which is actually at the end of my biology school year, but I do it at the beginning of the anatomy year. It's free in my TPT store, so I'll link it in the show notes, but it's called What is Life? And it gets them literally doing inquiry so well. They're asking questions, they're drawing conclusions, they're categorizing, they're coming up, constructing explanations. I'm obsessed with it and it's so simple, but it gets them to think about what the characteristics of life are. And even if you're doing this in an anatomy course or an AP biology, most likely they don't necessarily have it memorized still from biology 1 they took freshman year. So it's a great little refresher. And again, all of these examples I just gave you are going to give you day one that discussion with your students back and forth that we want to be integral to your class culture. Thank you so much for listening to the number 2 most listened to episode of the Secondary Science Simplified podcast in 2025. You can find the show notes with all the links mentioned at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 214. Remember, go there, go to episode 214 at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com. You will find the link to share your thoughts in the podcast survey as I'm planning new episodes for 2026. And I also want to remind you before I let you go that we are celebrating 10 years of It's Not Rocket Science. So I posted my first free resource December 20th, 2015. So we just passed the 10-year anniversary of that. But I didn't make my first sale of a paid resource until January 1st, 2016. So I kind of count January 1st as like my real anniversary. I made $2.20. So January 1st, which is just, a week and a half away, will be 10 years of It's Not Rocket Science, which is insane. I just cannot believe it's been a decade. So I would love for you to celebrate with me. And here are a few ways you can do that. So first, just hearing directly from you means so much. So that can look like you leaving a review for the podcast on Apple. It could mean you going on a TBT and leaving a review for an It's Not Rocket Science resource you've purchased. Or y'all, it can just be as simple as you going to Instagram and finding me. You can search Rebecca Joyner or It's Not Rocket Science. You'll see me and just DMing me. I would love, love, love to hear from you. So that's the first way I would love for you to celebrate with me. Second, while you're in those places, you could follow me. So as I'm recording this right now, so hopefully it's a smaller number by the time you actually hear this, but as of right now, I'm 600 people away on Instagram from 10,000. And so if you're on Instagram, you're DMing me already, just go ahead and follow or send my account to a couple teacher friends and have them follow. And if you're on TBT, you're reviewing a resource, I'm only like 200 people away there from 10,000 on TBT. And I just think, like I said, these numbers mean nothing other than vanity. But I just think it would be fun to hit 10K on Instagram and on TBT for 10 years by January 1st. So that's what I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed for. Now, if you want extra credit because you're an overachiever or you're just a huge Secondary Science Simplified podcast fan or It's Not Rocket Science resource fan, I would love if you would go to a teacher Facebook group that you're in and share about the podcast or share about It's Not Rocket Science resource. Now, you got to be careful about sharing about a resource because some of those groups don't let you share about resources, but the podcast is free and anybody can listen to it. And I'm the only person for the last 4 years straight who has put out a weekly podcast episode for high school science teachers specifically. So I just want every high school science teacher to know about the podcast. So if you could share about it in a Facebook group, that just means so much to me. I'm in a ton of these groups, but I basically never post about the podcast because I never want to be like self-promoting and gross. But I would love for you to share about it. It would just be exciting to see. Or if someone ever search Secondary Science Simplified, it'd be cool for them to see positive things said about it. Another thing you can do if you're like, I'm not doing anything publicly like that, even just share with your department or your district, the other science teachers. Say, hey, here's a podcast. It's totally for free. I've done this 4 years without any ads either, just to try to keep it ad free. And it's directly for you. So I would love to do that. And of course, if you're like, well, I want it to be even more for me, then you got to fill out the podcast survey. And then I can take your questions and things like that and make sure that I'm answering your questions and talking about the things you want to hear about on this podcast. So that's all in the show notes. There's links in the show notes to where you can find my Instagram, my TBT, all that jazz. But that's all at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 214. I would love for you to celebrate with me in this way. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.